Good evening. Many years ago, the wonderful African-American preacher Marshall Keeble was holding a tent meeting in Ridgely, Tennessee. And during the invitation, a white man came forward. And when Brother Keeble leaned in to take his confession, the man struck him across the face with some brass knuckles, knocking him to the ground. Some people rallied around him to make sure he was okay, and the next day the police came to where he was staying and encouraged him to press charges, but he refused to do so. He thought that would bring harm to the church, and he didn't want to do that. Many years later, they asked him about this incident, and he responded, sometimes you just have to take it. And that's true. Sometimes you just have to take it. Perhaps someone has lied about you. Maybe someone has said something very hurtful to you. Maybe someone has misrepresented you. Perhaps even worse. Maybe something has happened to you like what happened to Billy Joel. You know who Billy Joel is? 5-time Grammy Award winner, sold over 160 million records worldwide, 33 top 40 hits, 33 number ones on the top 40. In the Songwriters Hall of Fame. His ex-brother-in-law, Frank Weber, was his manager for a little while. And he asked Frank Weber, he said, I want you to take care of my finances. I don't want to mess with that. I don't want to have anything to do with it. And Frank Weber obliged. And over several years, $30 million disappeared. Just vanished. And when asked about it, Billy Joel said this, I'm not bitter about any of that stuff. People don't understand. I've met these guys again. I shake hands with them. I don't have any hard feelings. I don't. I saw Frank a couple of years ago out here in the Hamptons. He was going into a restaurant, and I said, hey, man, how you doing? We sat and talked. I have absolutely no hard feelings. I let all of that go. You can't carry that stuff around. You'd be mad your whole life. Bad things happen to good people, and bad things happen to bad people. What's even more amazing is the fact that Billy Joel's not a Christian. He was baptized in the Church of Christ in Hicksville, New York at one point, but now he considers himself an atheist. And stories like that touch us. They prick our hearts. They set forth a standard. Be like Marshall Keeble. Be like Billy Joel. Have that same kind of attitude. And yes, that's a worthy goal. At least to be like them in certain situations, like when it comes to forgiveness. But how do we find ourselves? How do we find ourselves most often when we're hurt or when we're the perpetrator? So when the shoe's on the other foot. We're often encouraged by preachers like me to be like Noah or David or Abraham, at least in their bright spots. But what about when you're the perpetrator? What about when you need forgiveness? Because you may not like to admit it, but you've lied. Maybe you've manipulated. Maybe you've stolen. Maybe you've cheated, coveted, whatever. We'd all like to think that we are more like Marshall Keeble or Billy Joel or one of those Bible heroes, but what's often the case is that we feel more like the villain than the hero. And because we see in the Faith Hall of Fame men and women who rose above their failures, we can be encouraged. And that's what this whole series has been about. Heroic faith that rises above our mistakes. Because of the faith of these people that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11, their glaring flaws are not what sticks out. It's not what's remembered. What's remembered is their faith. Look with me at Hebrews chapter 11. Verses 20 and 21 reads like this. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, even regarding things to come. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. So there's Jacob's name, right there among other notable figures of the Old Testament like Abraham, Moses, David, Joseph. Does anyone remember what Jacob's name means? What is it? God contends, or what else? God, he wrestles with God, right? I mean, if you know anything about Jacob's story, then you know that name fits him. Does anybody know what Jacob's name was changed to? It was changed to Israel, wasn't it? Does anyone know what Israel means in Hebrew? It means Prince of God. It can mean he who wrestles with God or God contends. If you know the story of Jacob, you know that his name change was rather fitting to the situation. But here's what I find interesting. I find it interesting that here in the Faith Hall of Fame, the writer chose to use his previous name. Don't you think that's interesting? Jacob actually means he grasped the heel, an obvious reference to the birth of him coming out and grasping Esau's heel when he comes out of his mother's womb. Jacob's name came to signify, though, deceit. If you look at verse 36 of Genesis chapter 27, it reads, "Then Esau said, 'Is he not rightly named Jacob? For he has betrayed me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. And he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me?'" Jacob's name became synonymous with deceptiveness. In other words, he was a trickster, he was a manipulator, he was a con artist, and we know how this reputation came about, don't we? If you look at Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 27, it says, "When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a civilized man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau, I should say, because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. When Jacob had cooked a stew one day, Esau came in from the field and was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Please let me have a mouthful of that red stuff there, for I am exhausted.' And therefore he is called Edom by name. But Jacob said, 'First sell me your birthright.' Esau said, 'Look, I am about to die, so of what use then is the birthright to me?' And Jacob said, 'First swear to me.' So he swore an oath to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and got up and went on his way. So Esau despised his birthright." So Esau traded his birthright for a bowl of momentary happiness. He thought with his belly. Instead of thinking with his head, he let his passion and desire control his actions. And Esau traded all the privileges of his inheritance for one short-lived moment of pleasure. At that moment, pleasure and happiness meant more to him than anything else. And when he pigged out on Jacob's famous recipe, he was making a decision that obviously would affect him the rest of his life. Now, Jacob was the manipulator. He's a trickster. But here it's on Esau. That's all his fault. Now move over to Genesis chapter 27. Jacob gets some help from his mother Rebekah, who was a pretty good manipulator in her own right. Isaac, the father of Jacob and Esau, is about to die, and as is customary, he is handing off the birthright to the firstborn. So he calls Esau into the room and tells him to go out into the field, kill him something, and make a delicious meal for him so he may bless him before he dies. Esau does like a good boy, and he carries out his father's command. That's when Rebekah and Jacob go to work. Rebekah tells Jacob to go in and get 2 of the flock and bring them back. These 2 choice goats, they're going to prepare a delicious meal for Isaac. And then she dresses Jacob in Esau's clothing and puts some of the goat skins over him, over his hands and neck, because Esau apparently was a hairy dude. And Isaac might want to touch his son, so we want it to appear like you're really hairy too. The plan worked, and Isaac gave Esau's birthright to the wrong son, and Jacob skipped town. Esau vowed to kill his brother, so Jacob spent much of his life as a fugitive on the run. Now, in order to understand this story better, you have to understand how important the Jewish birthright was. As the firstborn son, Esau would receive a double portion of his father's inheritance. And this would likely include land, animals, other valuables. And the birthright also assured that the firstborn would assume the role of head of the household. Jacob's deception led to constant tension between the 2 brothers. It's also important to note that this scenario plays out over and over again in Scripture. Maybe you've seen this thread, this theme of the older brother looking down on the younger brother, and yet God chooses the younger brother. And your mind's probably turning right now thinking of all the times that you see this theme. God chooses a younger son above the older brothers to be a blessing to humanity. Which one comes to mind? The one that first probably pops into your head is Joseph, right? So there's other brothers that are older, but God prefers the younger. Jacob and Esau would later become known as Israel and Edom, which also became the names of the families that descended from them. The two nations continued the sibling rivalry, and it was a tense relationship between these two brothers. You can look over at Numbers chapter 20 sometime and get a picture or a description of this tension. Nevertheless, the two nations, even though they were fighting, they shared a common bond because they're brothers. Now, you might remember a few years ago we talked about the minor prophets, and Obadiah specifically speaks to this theme. God speaks through the prophet and accuses Edom of being prideful and self-exalting. The Edomites lived in high desert rocks. They also lived a high and mighty existence, looking down on the others around them, especially the Israelites. They believed that they were superior, and the pride of the Edomites led to them standing idly by while the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, but then also participating in the destruction later on. Through Obadiah, God promises to humble Edom. He will bring them down from their heights and destroy them as they had done to Israel. So it will be done to them. Notice what is written in Obadiah, verses 17 through 21. It says, "But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be a stubble. And they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau. For the Lord has spoken. Then those of the Negev will possess the mountain of Esau, and those of the Shephelah, the Philistine plain, also possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. And the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as the Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad, will possess the cities of the Negev. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's." You see what's going on here? Do you see the bigger picture? So God chose Israel, and this caused tension between Israel and his older brother. It's that theme again. God chooses the younger brother over the older brother, and a rivalry ensues. And this relates to us, does it not? I mean, you think about it. We are the new Israel, which means that we are God's chosen children. The chosen child is always despised by his brothers. Jacob's family is always despised by Esau's family, and God's chosen people will always be despised by the world. The world around us is Edom. They are the Edomites, and they don't know God. And this guarantees that they will despise us. Have you noticed that the world despises Christians and that it's getting more and more tense? That there's more and more anti-Christian rhetoric out there? Edom looks down its nose at us because we hold a different standard. We refute what the world is doing. We condemn its teachings. We live life in a different direction. We don't play by the world's rules, and therefore there's tension between us and Edom. But listen to what is written in Deuteronomy chapter 23. Verse 7, "You shall not detest an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not detest an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land." Don't detest an Edomite. Why? Because he's your brother. At the end of the day, he's your brother. Note the symbolism. God says, "This is my chosen child, and this child is not chosen, and the child that is not chosen will despise the one that is chosen." And we can certainly see why this would happen. I mean, one brother is blessed, he's protected, he's sustained, he's provided for. I mean, what's so special about him? That's not fair. And although God's unchosen child hates his brother, God says to Israel, don't hate him back. Why? Because he's your brother. In other words, there will come a day when my people will include them, where the kingdom will be opened for all. The Edomites would be the Gentiles, right? The whole New Testament is about becoming the household of Jacob. We are the New Jerusalem. We have a part in God's story. It is no longer a narrow kingdom in which only those of Jewish descent have access. We are all God's people. We belong to Him. We were once not a people. We were once on the outside looking in, but not anymore. Now we belong. Don't detest an Edomite because they're your brother. And God loves them. And God wants them in the kingdom. Now look with me at Genesis chapter 32. Genesis chapter 32, beginning in verse 24. It reads, "Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the dawn is breaking.' But he said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' So he said to him, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' He said, 'Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked him and said, 'Please tell me your name.' But he said, 'Why is it that you ask my name?' And he blessed him there. So Jacob named that place Peniel, for he said, 'I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved.'" So Jacob had been running for his life. Now he's fighting for his life. He's in a wrestling match with God, and apparently he wins. Of course, anything that happens in a situation like that is only because God wanted it to happen, right? Nevertheless, Jacob passes whatever test that God is trying to place before him, and he receives a name change. Now remember, when you read about Jacob and Israel, always think Abraham and the promise made to him, okay? Anytime you read about Jacob and his descendants, that's what's going on in your mind, or at least it should. Also remember that we are the seed of Abraham, that we are a part of that lineage. So Christians are the nation that came forth from that promise that God made to Abraham. We are the blessed offspring. So back to this wrestling match. Jacob is grappling with this strange man. They wrestle all night, and Jacob is close to claiming victory when the man dislocates Jacob's thigh. And the strange man tells Jacob to let him go. Jacob refuses until he receives a blessing. The strange man changes his name. Jacob asks him his name, but the man responds, "Why do you ask my name?" and then blesses him. It's all weird, isn't it? I mean, that's pretty strange stuff, isn't it? I mean, if we're just being honest. So what is going on here? Well, first of all, God had big plans for Jacob. But in order to receive them, he had to first be broken. The con artist needed to be reformed. God had a great promise for Jacob, but Jacob needed to have his character altered so that he could receive it. He needed to be prepared for what God had in store for him. Jacob had spent his life as a deceiver and a manipulator. He didn't want to be controlled by God, but all of that was about to change. And in order for it to change, he had to be broken. Change hurts. Doesn't come without pain. But as painful as Jacob's injury was, he kept fighting. He kept going round and round with this stranger because he was desperate. What he wanted more than anything was more important than the pain. He wanted this blessing from God. He wanted it badly, so badly that he was willing to fight through the pain. And so the wrestling stops. The man changes Jacob's name to Israel. And that is huge because names aren't just nomenclature in the Bible. Names mean something. And they're often tied to a person's destiny. A name change from Jacob, which was synonymous with manipulation and deceit. A name change from that to Israel, which means he wrestles with God. That was highly significant. God is changing Jacob's identity. No longer would he be known as a schemer or a con artist or a manipulator. Now he would be known as Israel, a major player in the promise made to Abraham. You know, when my wife and I were dating, I was finishing up college, I was student teaching, I was working at the grocery store, and I was assistant coach as a volunteer at my alma mater in Paragould, Arkansas. So there wasn't much of me to go around. If Libby wanted to see me, she usually had to go to a game. And she would ride with me to the games that were out of town. She would sit in the stands, and she would watch, and I'm sure wasn't thrilled about that. She wasn't as bored as Blake, but it was pretty close. By the way, when Blake and Brianna were dating, I was at a Wiley game, and Brianna was watching her brother Bryson, and I looked over, and no kidding, Blake was like this. So she didn't hate basketball that much, but she certainly wasn't as into it as I was. But she loved me. And she wanted to be where I was. And because she loved what I loved, I changed her name. I mean, that was one of the reasons I loved her and I wanted to marry her, is because She bought into something that maybe she wouldn't have otherwise, but because it was important to me, it became important to her. And after we got married, after I changed her name and we got married, I was coaching in this little town of Charlotte, Arkansas, and she was sitting up in the stands among all these people who were crying out, I'm sure that guy doesn't know what he's doing, calling me every name under the sun, and she would sit there because she loved me. And because I loved her, I changed her name. Jacob endured the pain and God changed his name, right? Libby endured the pain and I changed her name. Jacob had to come to grips with who he was. He had to come to grips with his identity. God didn't change his name until he came clean about his identity. When asked his name, he replied, Jacob. He should have just said deceiver, manipulator, con artist, that's my name. And God says, not anymore. That's not who you are anymore. From now on, you'll be known as Israel, a name that signified change, a name that signified a whole new destiny, right? And here's something else. If you're not satisfied with your current identity, change it. You have time. You know when you don't have time? You know when you can't change anything? When you can't change anything? When you're dead? You're not dead yet. You can change. You can have a new identity. It's kind of like when you go to the doctor and he says, there's nothing more we can do. Well, then there's nothing more they can do. But as long as he's willing to cut on you, as long as he's willing to give you something, as long as he's willing to work with you, there's hope, right? There's hope this evening. There's still an opportunity. You can have a new name, a new identity. You can be different, you can be better, you can be his, but you have to be willing to change, and change will hurt. You have to be willing to endure the pain because following Jesus will interfere with your life. You have to be willing to let God work. By the way, did you notice that Jacob asked the man his name? Did you notice that? And did you notice the response from God? He said, why is it that you asked my name? And he blessed him there. That seems a little strange, at least on the surface, until you consider that what the man is really saying is, in essence, look at your new name, and you'll know who I am. Look at the name I gave you, and you'll know exactly who I am. Israel means he who wrestles with God or God contends. Look at your new name, your new identity, and you will know exactly who I am because you bear the name of the one who blessed you. Same is true with us. Your identity is found in the one who changed your name. You bear the name of the one who has blessed you. And hopefully, when people know your new name, they'll know his name. That when they look at you, they see him. Go back to Hebrews 11:21. By faith, Jacob, and again, I find it interesting that they say Jacob and not Israel. By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshiped, leaning on the top of his staff. So what was Jacob's blessing? What was his blessing? 12 tribes of Israel, 12 sons, right? A whole nation. And sure, there were issues with the sons. When all was said and done, though, he blessed each of Joseph's sons. In other words, he passed on a legacy. It kind of reminds me of the little pygmy warrior that was standing over a dead rhinoceros, and somebody asked him, what happened to the rhinoceros? The little pygmy warrior said, I killed him. And they asked him, well, how did you kill him? He said, with a club. They said, well, how big was your club? And he said, I don't know, there's about 100 people in my club. We are a holy nation. We're a huge club. We can defeat anything with this club. Certainly, we can rise above the devil and his temptation. God has given us a club, just like he gave Jacob a club. He gave him a nation. He gave him a new name. He gave him a new identity. He gave him a legacy. He gave him a place in the Faith Hall of Fame. Jacob is the con artist that God used, and he can use you too. But you've got to be ready and willing to change. Are you? And if you are, why don't you come as we stand and as we sing?